It is great to be joined once again by economist Richard Wolff, professor emeritus at my alma mater, the University of Massachusetts, a visiting professor at the New School University in New York City. Professor Wolff, you had this great article recently on the Democracy at Work website called The Contradictions of Finance. And it talked in very interesting terms about some of the inherent contradictions of our financial system. And it really got me thinking more broadly about some of the contradictions that exist in sort of on our planet, for lack of a better term. I'll start more broad than where you were in the article and let you take us wherever you want. And the contradiction that I'm sort of thinking of is our system, which includes everything from lending, stock markets, increased consumption as something to be sort of never-endingly pursued, is based on the idea of unlimited growth, but we have a planet which is of a limited size. It contains limited resources. It does, at least theoretically, although according to many we are very far from that limit, it will only house a certain number of humans. And to me, that is one of the most interesting sort of inherent contradictions in the way we think about our planet and economies. I'll turn it over to you, and you can tell us sort of how your article ties into that, or feel free to comment in any way you see fit.
No, I think you make a very good point, and it is generalizable. People once thought that there were unlimited supplies of trees. The European economic development over the last 5,000 years has taught the people of Europe that there are no, in fact, unlimited numbers of trees, and they can't use wood as a fuel, and they can't use wood in the way they once did. And they found other things to do, but they were very difficult transitions to make. And we are now discovering that having shifted from wood, for example, as a fuel, to coal and then to fossil fuels like oil and gas, they also produce horrible side effects and have limits. So that you might have thought the population would have been trained by now to understand the contradictions and to not be so glib about imagining the limitlessness of whatever it is they're doing, rather than paying attention to what the quote-unquote side effects were, which can come back and become more important than the thing itself. And there are plenty of other examples. Let me just give you two that are very pertinent today.
Yeah.
Well, one, the capitalist system of the world crashed in 2008. And most people of the world are still living in the aftermath and in the consequences of that crash. In order to try to cope with it, the central banks around the world, the leading financial institutions in each capitalist country, here in America, the Federal Reserve, pushed interest rates way, way down to where they are today, barely above zero in many parts of the world, and downright negative in Japan and Europe and in parts of the United States now. Well, that was supposed to be a recovery mechanism. But here's the contradiction. Because interest rates were so low, we now have the highest level of indebtedness by American corporations in the history of the United States. We have a level of indebtedness of corporations all over the world like that. They all took advantage of these very low interest rates to borrow money like there was no tomorrow. And if there is an economic slowdown at any time, and many predicted for this year or next, then it is a very dangerous situation to have an economic slowdown at a time when corporations are weighed down by debt they are required to repay and may not be able to, and we may be looking at another crash. That's a contradiction that people were not willing to deal with and think about for the last 8 years of keeping interest rates at this low level. Last example, just to make it clear to folks. There's another part of capitalism that has always mystified many economists who've looked at it. Every capitalist enterprise, large, medium, and small, is constantly trying to save on labor costs. You're considered a clever, effective businessman or woman if you can reduce the number of workers you need to produce your output, or you can in some way get less expensive workers to replace the more expensive one. We know that companies go overseas to do that. We know that they bring immigrants into the country to move in that direction, and so on. But here's the contradiction. If capitalists in their competition with one another are indeed successful, either in reducing the number of workers they need or in paying workers less, and especially if they do both, and let's add if they can replace high-cost workers with less expensive machines, what we used to call automation, well, then there's going to be a problem, because with fewer people earning less money, you can't sell the output of those very enterprises that congratulated themselves on reducing their labor costs. In other words, you may save on labor, but you're going to pay a heavy price in the inability to sell what you produce. Now, these are real contradictions that beset all of modern capitalist economies, the ecological one, this problem of lowering your labor costs, the problem with lending, and they reflect on a system whose contradictions are not just some matter for academics to debate about, but these are very real stumbling blocks that the system puts in its own way.
There's to piggyback on this idea of you're winning as a corporation if you are saving on the labor side, but then you are actually creating a situation where fewer people can then afford to buy your products or services. We have another contradiction that comes to my mind, which is, on the one hand, we've sort of made one of the championed ideas of our system that of being able to buy and consume more. That's one of the great things that our system allows people to seek and rewards and is seen favorably by society. But at the same time, we've seen that same system create larger than ever wealth and income inequality gaps. And it actually makes it so that consumption that is so revered is also something that becomes more difficult to do. And it's similar to this idea of at the individual corporation level that you mentioned, but it's sort of the idea of what the system is set up to allow and what it actually allows, isn't it?
Absolutely. The metaphor that I've found useful in the classes that I teach goes like this, that what we do in the realm of consumption and advertising to people as to what the good life requires you to buy, and then making it impossible by means of limited wage increases, by means of having to carry debt. That means you have to take a certain amount of your weekly pay and put it aside to pay off your past debt and don't even have it available for consumption now. It's a little bit like that horrible example when you have a little dog and you teach the dog to jump for a biscuit. But each time the dog jumps, you raise the biscuit a little further. So he jumps a little higher, but you raise it a little further. Eventually, you drive the dog crazy with the sheer frustration of such a level of non-success. And not to push it too far, I do believe that the more inequality we have, the more we are treated to scenes of the super rich with their yachts and their apartments and their ski chalets and their fancy cars and the industry that caters to all of that, the more the distance between all of that and what most of us can afford, the more the sense of bitterness, of frustration, showing up in our politics these days, showing up in the rage that so many people feel and that occasionally explodes. You're talking about a society whose contradictions are becoming a problem of the dysfunction of the system as a whole.
Last thing I want to touch on, you mentioned politics. Is there anything that is substantively different between the policies suggested by, to the extent we can understand them, at least with regard to, well, maybe both of the major candidates, but certainly one in particular, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton? Is there anything that big picture in terms of the economic system that we have that would be different if one or the other were to be elected president?
Frankly, I don't think so. I think the major thing that both of those candidates are doing is pretending that these contradictions don't exist, aren't of a scale that they need to worry about. Either they ignore them altogether, or in some kind of sick mockery, propose things that will actually make them worse, or, on the other hand, propose the most modest kinds of marginal adjustments whose scale is way less than what the problem demands. It's sort of like being given a diagnosis of cancer and having someone suggest, well, wow, with a diagnosis like that, I'd go out and buy more Band-Aids than you currently have. And you have to say to such a person, goodness, the scale of what you propose relative to the problem I have is kind of virtually indecent in its pretense that I'm not confronting a much bigger problem. My fear is that American politics, at least of the two major parties, is an effort to distract, to deflect onto personalities and who's telling more truths and who isn't, and who's got this kind of style and another. These are all a little bit like watching a distracting television or movie because you don't want to deal with your problems, rather than dealing with an election whose ostensible purpose is to face your actual problems and try to solve them.
We have been speaking with Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts and current visiting professor at New School University in New York City, economist Richard Wolff. A pleasure as always having you.
Thank you, David, and I look forward to the next time.